George Sorel, Myth and Violence. So today we're going to go into and dissect Sorel's book, Reflections of Violence, and a few of his other works. Now, we won't dive into the book itself because it's a very dated piece. There's a lot of references to the politicians of the time, to some of the movements of the time, some of the movements from just a little before their time. So in order to dive into the book, we would first have to go into who this person is, and what this movement was, etc., which would get us totally off course. What Sorel is known for and why he has endearment from everyone from fascist to communist to anarchist and many in between is because of his two major topics that he spoke upon, which were myth and violence. Now, Sorel was born 1847, died in 1922 at the age of 74. And Reflections of Violence came out around 1906, 1907. Throughout Sorel's life, and this is probably why he's had so much influence on so many differing people in their politics, Sorel kind of bounced around himself between more right and more left. There was periods of time, like when he wrote Reflections of Violence, when he was very anti-statist and anti-patriotic. And then there were times where he became more nationalistic and more into the concept of the state and the nation. And then there were times he broke away from it, like the outbreak of World War I kind of sent him back to being more stateless ideology. And that's when he had his last break with the more nationalist tendencies of the socialist movements. Now, he was an advocate, whether he was going right or left, or whether syndicalism was going right or left, he was always an advocate of French syndicalism. And what syndicalism was, just a quick brief breakdown of what French syndicalism, how it started. It was basically a gathering between socialists and anarchists into forming the syndicalist party. And they broke away from the typical socialist and anarchist because they saw there was a lot of inaction and just empty rhetoric amongst the socialists. And the syndicalists wanted to be more, action-orientated and more active. And what their belief was that there'd be no controlling central authority, but rather just different guilds and producers mutually in agreement with each other. And this is how you get about life. And so we kind of see a combining of anarchist and socialist ideology there, just into these guilds, not to the state. Now, this is resemblant of Strausserism, what Strausserism was, except Strausserism had a central authority over these guilds. Sorel and many of the syndicalists did not believe in this central authority. Now, syndicalism is often criticized because it went nowhere. It stayed a minority ideal amongst the socialists. Kind of like you look at like the Bernie bros of today, and then anytime you go to these socialist gatherings or meetings, you'll have your 95%, which are what Sorel would say were people who backed parliamentary socialists. And we'll get into what those are in a bit. Those are basically your politicians and socialists. Then you always have that group amongst the greater group of the socialists, the ones with the red flags and dressed in all black, and that is actually have read the works of Marx, and they actually have fun, and they're more action orientated. They're more into promoting their ideology if violence is necessary by using violence, and they're usually, let's say, 5% of the crowd at these Bernie bro get-togethers. And this is what the syndicalists kind of were. They were a small fraction of the socialists and a more action and orientated and more fanatical, group of these. So this is why it's criticized because it never gained any big traction amongst the socialist movement. So before we get into myth and violence, let's first break down these parliamentary socialists first because he references them a lot. Once again, these are like the Bernie Sanders and the Elizabeth Warren of today, and whoever else fits that mold of these, pseudo-socialists that play within the system, and they, on one hand, they have all this great rhetoric. On the other hand, they're living comfortably and playing within the cabinet rules of the system they're a part of. He says, today parliamentary socialists no longer believe in insurrection. If they sometimes speak of it, it is to give themselves an air of importance. This is, we see like Madonna talking about burning down the White House and all these silly, oh, you're so revolutionary. Oh, you're so dangerous and edgy. Yeah. This gives them their air of importance. And we see that with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie too. Sometimes their rhetoric does not match their frail, old, weak, bourgeois bodies at all. But let's go on. It is to give themselves this air of importance. They teach that the ballot box has replaced the gun, but the means of acquiring power might have changed without there being a change of mental attitude. Parliamentary socialists can only have great influence if, through the use of very confused language, they can impose themselves on very diverse groups. They must have working class constituents simple enough to allow themselves to be duped by high-sounding phrases about the future collectivism. They are compelled to represent themselves as profound philosophers to stupid members of the bourgeois who wish to appear well-informed about social questions. It is very necessary for them to be able to exploit rich people who think that they are earning the gratitude of humanity by taking shares in the enterprises of political socialism. And we're seeing this going on all today, like once again, the trendy limousine liberals, oh, I'm a socialist, I support Bernie, or the bourgeois, actors and actresses all getting behind Bernie. It's like, this is their ideal of I'm doing charity, essentially. This influence is founded upon gibberish, and our great men endeavor sometimes, only too successfully, to spread confusion amongst the ideas of their readers. They detest the general strike because all the propaganda surrounding it is too socialistic to please the philanthropists. So in the general strike is a massive strike of all working sectors. It's not resolved with simply raising the pay wages. Like, there has to be victory in the general strike. It's not simply, oh, okay, we're going to raise your money. Here you go. We're going to make a deal. We'll meet you halfway. It's a more fanatical attitude in this. So those are the parliamentary socialists that Sorel hated in his time and often criticized and mocked. All right, so now let's go into Sorel's thoughts on violence itself. A social policy based upon bourgeois cowardice, which consists in always surrendering before the threat of violence, cannot fail to engender the idea that the bourgeoisie is condemned to death and that its disappearance is only a matter of time. Every conflict which gives rise to violence thus becomes a vanguard fight, and no one can foresee what will come out of such skirmishes. The great battle never materializes, but each time that they come to blows, the strikers hope that this is the beginning of the great Napoleonic battle, the one that will crush the vanquished definitively. In this way, the practice of strikes engenders the notion of the catastrophic revolution. So the syndicalists during strikes would hope for violence. It is very difficult to understand proletarian violence as long as we try to think in terms of the ideas disseminated by bourgeois philosophy. According to this philosophy, violence is a relic of barbarism, which is bound to disappear under the progress of enlightenment. Does that mean that they are completely opposed to violence? It would not be in their interest for the people to remain completely calm. A certain amount of agitation suits them, but it must be within the well-defined limits and controlled by politicians. Unrest, cleverly channeled, is extremely useful to parliamentary socialists. We're seeing perfect examples of this today. This goes parallel to exactly what's going on today as I record this. Who boast to the government and to the rich bourgeoisie of their ability to moderate revolution, right? Keeping it fashionable, so you can have Hollywood stars playing revolutionaries on Twitter and on stages where they're making these outrageous statements. They can thus arrange the success of their financial affairs in which they are interested. important in the eyes of the simpletons who imagine that these socialists are great reformers of the law. For this to succeed, there must always be a certain amount of agitation, and the bourgeois must always be kept in that state of fear. So we see perfect examples of this today. Perfect examples. It just goes completely hand in hand. They have this channeled, restrained violence, and they even try to pull it back too when it starts getting a little out of hand. But we'll go into that a little later. Let's continue on with what Sorel was saying on the topic of violence. Okay, he's going to get into the differences of force and violence here. Sometimes the terms force and violence are used in speaking about acts of authority, sometimes in speaking of acts of revolt. It is obvious that the two cases give rise to two very different consequences. I think that it would be better to adopt a terminology which would give rise to no ambiguity, and that the term violence should be employed only for the second sense. We should say, therefore, that the object of force is to impose a certain social order in which the minority governs, while violence tends to the destruction of that order. The bourgeoisie have used force since the beginning of modern times, while the proletariat now reacts against the middle class and against the state by violence. So he's drawing that distinction right there. If the state apparatus is using violence, he's calling that force. And if the proletariat uses this violence, it's called violence. He's essentially trying to moralize the different forms of violence. There are so many legal precautions against violence, and our education is directed towards so weakening our tendencies towards violence that we are instinctively inclined to think that any act of violence is a manifestation and a return to barbarism. So we see that today in any case of violence is brought forth as barbarism, and it's both on left and right, quote unquote left and right. You'll see on the left, even though that they're more active and more violent, it's that channeled violence that we were just speaking about a second ago, that Sorel was just speaking about. And you'll often see in these leftist groups, there'll be these riots and protests, there'll be an initial explosion of quick violence, and then people pulling it back in. Okay, stop. The guy got knocked out. Okay, you'll have people coming around like, okay, that's enough. Or they're vandalizing someone's car, and someone will come around and get everyone away after they've done the initial vandalism. And they're not doing it because there's this, the people in the crowd just came to this moral epiphany that what they're doing was wrong or something. They know because it looks bad as far as their propaganda goes, their image goes, because violence has been brought to the level of barbarism in everyone's mind. Essentially, all the virtue has been taken out of violence. And this is also on the right as well. You just had incidents where you had this advocate for white nationalism get sucker punched. And then you see the reaction from the right was all a bunch of whining about violence, right? Oh, God, they're violent. They're backing their ideas with violence. Well, how do you think this country that we live in was created, right? How has any great change come about? I mean, we've lost sight of this, that this is a fundamental reality. I mean, we go to what Machiavelli said on this. Hence it comes that all armed prophets have been victorious and all unarmed prophets have been destroyed. I mean, welcome to Life 101. Welcome to History 101. The problem is this violence has been emasculated, essentially. All the virtue has been taken out of violence. Essentially, there is no cause of violence anymore in the people, a unified cause. Now, violence is individualized into personal gain, be it through a robbery, be it through gaining something of material, so you commit violence on someone, or of this false bravado, which exists because there is a lack of masculine virtues in people. So now you have this false bravado. Someone I know, if I dare shamelessly plug myself, did a little poem on just this.
I know you and what you will say. I'll kick your ass and show you I'm a man. But those are just feminine emotions expressed into rage. No vision in your violence, completely devoid of a cause. Just bravado posturing to convince me of your balls.
So yeah, there is this virtue in violence that we have forgotten about, and all true social change, whether you like it or not, whether you like to acknowledge or not, there's going to be violence involved in it. And we are going closer and closer to that point. Myth and violence will become a great part of our future, and believe that. You can take that to the bank, because how everything's been progressing, we see it's going to play the same role. We're seeing now that you're having the last holdouts of the line divided between the right and the left of society, essentially. And we're just going to categorize it in these two large sections, because that is most palatable to everybody to understand those terms. But it's getting heavily divided. And as if you've been paying attention to this channel, I've been saying for a while now that it's going to take a united fist on the right to crush the left. And that's what's going to happen. So the fist is starting to close right now. So you still have the fingers out there that have not balled up yet. And those are the libertarians, the capitalists, the people that worship Ayn Rand and John Locke and whoever else, people like that. And as the realization comes, the only way to combat a unified, aggressive, violent left is to become a unified, aggressive, violent right. And so that realization is coming about. But the violence that stems from this, it's not barbarism. There is few things more virtuous in this life than violence for a belief and cause. Few things more beautiful in man. Few things more beautiful in man. They have, let's go, for instance, let's go a little detour here real quick, because violence truly does get a bad rap. And it's not violence for violence sake. Once again, we have to draw that line, right? We go back to the Aristotle ethics. We go back to that medium, that mean. And this, like we find morality in that mean, like we found righteousness in that mean, and so many issues, same with violence. If you're too little of violence, you're a pacifist. You get walked over, you achieve nothing. If you're too much of violence, you're a brute, you're a thug. You're someone who's not a cultured thug, but just a thug. So, but when we get that middle, we find that cultured thug right there, right? We find someone who's willing to commit violence for beliefs, for love especially. So let's, with that said, let's go into this fine little book entitled The Glory of the Trenches, talking about the World War I trench warfare now. Just bear with me on this quick detour as we dive into some of the beauties of man that has been accomplished in violent situations and how it's so righteous and so beautiful. And I'll give you this example and another, but I can give you 1,000 examples on it. In the recent attack, the Huns set to work to knock out our artillery, Huns being the Germans of World War I. This is coming from a British man. He commenced with heavy shelling of our batteries. This lasted for some hours. He followed up by clapping down on them with a gas barrage. So they shot gas into him. The gunners' only chance of protecting themselves from the deadly fumes was to wear their gas helmets. Of the gun detachment, there are 2 men who cannot do their work accurately in gas helmets. One of these is the layer, and the other is the fuse setter. If the infantry were to be saved, 2 men out of the detachment of each protecting gun must sacrifice themselves. Instantly, without waiting for orders, the fuse setter and layers flung aside their helmets. Our guns opened up. The unmasked men lasted for about 20 minutes when they had to be dragged out of the gun pits, choking or in convulsions. 2 more took their places without a second's hesitation. This went on upward for 2 hours. Look at that sacrifice. That love. How is there not virtue in that? How does that not bring out the virtue of man? And before that moment, they weren't aware they were willing to sacrifice themselves for a whole battalion of brothers next to them. They were not aware of that. It was, and like he says, instantly, without orders or anything, they flung off their gas masks and they got on the guns and they got after it like there was no tomorrow, because there wasn't. And then, as they're choking, convulsing, being dragged out, who knows what their fate is, and people are seeing them and having to drag them out, what are they doing? They're pulling off their mask and they're getting on their job of laying and fuse setting. That beauty in man goes unmatched. And violence, righteous violence, can bring man to his highest potential. For instance, let's even go to today. In Iraq, there was a Navy SEAL by the name of Mikey Mansour. And a grenade was thrown onto their rooftop positions. And with a split second to realize the grenade had bounced off of his chest, hit the floor. He could have jumped and saved himself, but he had his teammates by his side. What did he do? Without a moment of hesitation, he jumped on that grenade. He ate that blast and he died. He sacrificed himself for his teammates. And what his teammates saw on that day, and what I am for sure will ever remain with them, was they saw man at his finest moment. And that forever will shake their foundations of what masculine is, of what brotherhood was, what was brought out, this beauty that was brought out through righteous violence.
You were with Michael. You were his platoon leader there in Iraq. Can you tell us about what took place on that day, how things went down, that he ended up giving his life for the rest of you?
Sure, sir. Well, to that point, just to set the stage a little bit, we'd been fighting insurgents in Ramadi, Iraq, which is the capital of Al-Anbar province and most violent part of Iraq at that time in 2006. We'd been fighting insurgents in the streets with the U.S. Army for 7 months. And even though we were 2 weeks from going home, the U.S. Army had a big push they wanted to do, so we absolutely were going to fight hand in hand with our brothers on the battlefield, as that's what we do. So that day, we had taken position on the flanks to protect the U.S. Army as they maneuvered in the streets. And I had 2 sniper teams that had taken rooftop positions to interdict the enemy as they maneuvered towards friendly forces. And Mike himself on his rooftop had taken position between 2 SEAL snipers that were contacting the enemy as they closed in. And we had been in heavy fighting all morning, and a enemy insurgent had come out between some dead space and lobbed a hand grenade onto Michael's rooftop. It hit him in the chest, and he was in a unique position to save his own life, as the cover of a brick wall was about 4 feet away. But the man to his left and guys around him could not have moved so quickly. So instead of saving his own life and going home, he saved his teammates, and seeing the grenade bounce off his chest and hit the ground, he smothered it with his body. And you know, it was absolutely in keeping with Mike's character as a SEAL, as a sailor, as a soldier. And I would just like to say that also the men he saved, 2 of them had kids and families. Mike did not. So always remember sacrifice, sir.
So there's this, we demonize violence, but there is a virtue to violence. Violence has been bastardized. It's been, you know what? It's been capitalized, right? It's been turned for material profit. So it's easy to call it savagery, because a lot of times it is. You're getting shot over your shoes or robbed for your money. This is brute violence. But violence for a cause, willing to sacrifice for a cause, whether that cause is your politics or your brothers next to you once you're in battle, whatever they may be, that's admirable. There's true virtue in that. So we are too quick to demonize it, and people on the right and left are too quick to turn it into pure barbarism or classify it as that. But it is much more than that. And we are heading towards the era which is going to come to that realization again. So he goes into this to point out a little bit of the virtue of violence here. And he quotes a little bit from philosopher Hartman on this. There is a tendency for the old ferocity to be replaced by the cunning. And many sociologists believe that this is a real progress. Some philosophers, who are not in the habit of following the herd, do not see exactly how this constitutes as progress from their point of view of morality. If we are revolted by the cruelty and brutality of past times, says Hartman, it must not be forgotten that uprightness, sincerity, a lively sentiment of justice, pious respect before holiness of morals characterized the ancient peoples. While today we see predominant lies, duplicity, treachery, the spirit of deception, the contempt for property, disdain for instinctive probity and legitimate customs, the value of which are no longer understood. Robbery, deceit, and fraud increase in spite of legal repression and more rapidly than brutal and violent crimes, such as pillage, murder, and rape, decrease. Egoism of the basest kind shamelessly breaks the sacred bonds of the family and friendships in every case in which these oppose its desires. There has been no lack of philosophers to protest at this softening of sentences. After what we have related earlier about Hartman, we shall expect to meet him among those who protest. We are already, he says, approaching the time when the theft and lying condemned by the law will be despised as vulgar errors, as gross clumsiness, by the clever cheats who know how to preserve the letter of the law while infringing the rights of other people. Any of this sound familiar? For my part, I would much rather live amongst the ancient Germans at the risk of being killed on occasion than being obliged, as I am in modern cities, to look on every man as a swindler or a rogue unless I have evident proofs of his honesty. So this actually kind of reminds me of prison in a sense. In prison, you have a prison code, and there's basic understandings in there where it gets a little more. Your word matters, your character matters much more, and you're able to identify people right away, knowing who's a thief, who's a cheat, who's a liar, because it's easier to classify and identify all the people around you. You're in this closed environment, and your words are held accountable. And since there is that, believe it or not, in most places where there's serious convicts, there's a lot more respect and civility amongst the inmates in these places because you have this threat of violence for disrespect. You have this threat of violence for being cunning, for being a liar, for being a thief. Like once you've been labeled things like a cell thief is one of the worst things to be labeled. It's you got child molester, rat, and cell thief, and it's this. So there is a morality there that doesn't exist. You go into the outside world and then your word doesn't matter. It's all about cunning and lying and advancing yourself at the cost of someone else. So there is that certain, honesty or returning to naturalness amongst people in those environments, which you would think you wouldn't find, but which are actually, very favorable to a man of character. As crazy as that sounds, like there is that truthfulness in it all that doesn't exist out in this modern society. And just as this modern society degrades, of course, the cultures in the prisons also degrade slowly as well, to where being cunning and a liar becomes the norm and becomes the success. But it's not completely like that yet, and it still exists where you can kind of visit somewhat of that mentality that used to exist. And you could see the results of it, where you have a more honest and honorable and respectful and more stand-up people, to be quite frankly honest with you. I've met more stand-up and deep individuals incarcerated than I ever have outside, than I ever have through going through college, than I have anything, any aspect of this life outside of prison. Believe it or not, I've met more solid stand-up people who you knew exactly what their character was and who they were. And a lot of pieces of shit as well. I'm not romanticizing anything. I'm just telling you the percentages of the people you meet. That's what it is, because most people out here, once again, it's all about the cunning and the lying and the manipulating and the hiding yourself. Everyone wears a mask. So it's what I mean is the metaphorical mask, not an actual one, even though some people do that as well. But so there is that frankness in that, and where the potential of violence is there is that frankness in our interactions and how we conduct ourselves. That actually, as Hartman points out here, has and Sorel highlights, has quite a positive effect on a man, on their behavior, on their character, on their morality. All right, let's go on now. There would never have been any great act of valor in war if each soldier, while acting as a heroic individual, claimed to receive a reward equal to his merit. When a column sets forth on assault, the men who march at its head know that they are sent to their death, and that glory will fall upon those who, passing over their dead bodies enters into the enemy's position. However, they do not reflect upon this great injustice, but march forward. When in an army the need for rewards is strongly felt, it may be said that its value is on the decline. Now, this is exactly what we're talking about. This is our military today. They have to bribe you to get into the military. College this, insurance this, etc., etc. You're having, if people go into it through pure patriotism or pure belief in the military system itself, that is one thing, or pure passion, one thing. But when you're bribing people to get it, when you're materializing the reason why people get into the military, while you're essentially, capitalizing it or capitalization of it, it's degrading that military. It's degrading what the military is about or who goes into the military. Because now you're quantifying and materializing this violence. You're taking the virtue out of the violence. You're saying, and the virtue is that the patriot who joins and enlists because he wants to protect the idea of his country or his family and his people, etc. But when you say, oh, we'll give you 4 years of college, oh, guess what? You have to go to war, commit violence now. You've degraded that violence, You've degraded the violence. You've taken the virtue out of it, and in turn put non-virtuous people into that system as well. You've attracted them through your bribes. Once again, that's just another highlight of the failures of capitalism, the hollowness of it. Proletarian violence not only makes the future revolution certain, but it seems also to be the only means by which European nations, at present stupefied by humanitarianism, can recover their former energy. Yeah, that humanitarianism, we're still dealing with it today, right? This irrational, love everyone we focus on, but ignore the people we don't focus on kind of mentality, virtue signaling and all this is, it's so inflated, even more so than his time. If Sorel thought he had it bad in the late 1800s, early 1900s, welcome to the 2000s. I mean, it's running rampant right now. To those who accuse the syndicalists of being obtuse and ignorant people, we have the right to ask them to consider the economic decadence for which they are working. Let us salute the revolutionaries as the Greeks saluted the Spartan heroes who defended Thermopylae and helped preserve civilization in the ancient world. Yeah, so the vanguard of the syndicalists, the violence of it, this is how they're viewing it. It's a protection of the civilized world, because continuing down the path of materialism, individualism, and capitalism, you get the decadence we have today. And this is what they were trying to stop. This is in France. And do you know what Paris looked like in 1905? The culture it had? Do you know what it looks like today? This is what he was trying to stop. But the individualist, the proletarian socialist, the ones that wanted to play game, essentially just intellectuals that like to wax poetic and get paid for it, and take no part in actually changing anything. And so you saw this is the results of what's happened in his country alone, and this is what they tried to stop. And only through violence as a tool, not the only tool, but just one of the tools amongst many, needed to be used. So this is becoming more understood today, because we're more on the brink now. We're starting to see this in America. It's starting to get more understood now. But this is something that's still hostilely fought against by the individualists on the right, especially. I think the last people to come around are going to be these libertarians and individualists and capitalists. They're going to be the last people to finally come around and realize this. But we're in the process of that now. So violence is the tool of the vanguard. Let's not forget that. And that's not just my opinion. That's not just Sorel's opinion. That's World History 101. I mean, this isn't just something you think about the air and say, yeah, violence is a tool, a necessary tool. It shouldn't be so demonized, or it shouldn't be so ignored. That fact shouldn't be so ignored. That's just how, once again, that's just how many of the main changes of civilizations have come about. Violence was always a factor. Capitalist society is so rich, and the future appears to it in such optimistic colors, that it endures the most frightful burdens without complaining overmuch. In America, politicians waste large amounts of taxation shamelessly In Europe, military preparation consumes sums that increase every year. Social peace might very well be brought by a few additional sacrifices. Experience shows that the bourgeoisie allows itself to be plundered quite easily, provided that the little pressure is brought to bear that they are intimidated by the fear of revolution. The party which can most skillfully manipulate the specter of revolution will possess the future. That is what the Radical Party is beginning to understand. And that is what we're beginning to understand too. And what he's saying as we close out the section on violence and get ready to head into myth, what he's stating is what we all know. What Beethoven once even said in his letters. He says, as long as the Germans have, sausage and beer, they're not going to have no revolutions. As long as we're comfortable, we'll put up with so much. Well, we're doing it right now. We're doing it right now. As long as we're going to continue to put up with so much. So it's these more radical factions that take the horse by the reins, essentially when we're talking about a revolution. So let's get into myth. So now we're getting into myth now, and how Sorel states what his myth is, because what endeared him to fascists and many communists was because the myth and the violence. The violence was both fascism and Bolshevism and communism were all action orientated. We're all willing to get into street fights and fight for their ideals. And so the idea of violence and the virtue in violence that Sorel spoke of was a message readily available to, or openly accepted by both sides. Now, myth is another one. And when we speak about myth, we could talk about anything from a religion to an idea of a great society. People who are willing to fight for the religion, they fight for this myth. People who are willing to fight for the politics, like fascists, are fighting for this myth of a better society. People that are fighting communism are fighting for this myth of egalitarianism. So it's everyone has this myth, and you need this. You can't be completely devoid of myth, essentially meta, and any kind of meta belief or inspiration or ideal, and be passionately willing to fight and sacrifice for something. It just can happen. You can't. This is why, once again, at the vanguard in every part of revolution and battles, it's not the intellectuals that are there. Like I said, the intellectuals are happy, waxing poetic and finding reasons why they can pick apart the myth and not do anything. Because, what's the point? It's just a myth. But people who are engulfed in a myth seek to make that myth reality or believe that myth to be reality. So it's a very, very powerful motivator for people. And it is absolutely detrimental. More so important than using violence as a tool. Myth is the most important tool. Like the idea of a greater society is a myth that we seek to turn to a reality. And this is why we fight for that myth. So people have to accept it, be passionate about it, and believe that myth. So he says, Sorel says in a letter to Daniel Helvey in 1907, men who are participating in a great social movement always picture their coming of action as a battle in which their cause is certain to triumph. These constructions, knowledge of which is so important for the historians, I propose to call myths. The Syndicalists' general strike and Marx's catastrophic revolution are such myths. As remarkable examples of such myths, I have given those which are constructed by primitive Christianity, by the Reformation, by the revolutions and the followers of Mazzini. I now wish to show that we should not attempt to analyze such groups of images in the way that we analyze a thing into its elements, but that they must be taken as a whole, as historical forces, and that we should be able to especially careful not to make any comparison between accomplished fact and the picture people had formed for themselves before their action. I could have given one more example, which is perhaps still more striking. Catholics have never been discouraged even in the hardest trials because they have always pictured the history of the church as a series of battles between Satan and the hierarchy supported by Christ. Every new difficulty which arises is only an episode in a war which must finally end in the victory of Catholicism. People who are living in the world of myths, are secure from all refutation. This has led many to assert that socialism is a kind of religion. For a long time, people have been struck by the fact that religious convictions are unaffected by criticism, and from that they have very concluded that everything which claims to be beyond science must be religion. Okay, he goes on, we're going back to Reflections of Violence here. Socialists must be convinced that the work to which they are devoting themselves is a serious, formidable, and sublime work. It is only on this condition that they will be able to bear the innumerable sacrifices imposed on them by propaganda, which can produce neither honors, profits, nor even immediate intellectual satisfaction. Even if the only result of the idea of the general strike was to make the socialist conception more heroic, it should on that account alone be looked upon as having incalculable value. We're going to end on that quote from Reflections of Violence, but let's look at what he's talking about there, and we go back again to what do you believe and how do you promote it? Do you look at what you believe as a serious thing? Do you promote it as a serious thing? Is it something that you've applied all righteousness to this? Are you willing to sacrifice for this or not? Push forward for this? Go through hardships for this or not? Many of you may say yes, but the answer is truly no, because your action will tell us more so than your words ever could, and tell you more about yourself than your words to yourself ever could. And this is where the myth comes in. This is where you have to attach this metaphysical belief system to whatever it is you're passionate about. There has to be this myth attached to it, be it your politics, your religion. Like, if you're a religious person, you should really be a religious person and really believe it is fundamental to your survival in the afterlife to adhere, live by, and not allow your religion to be destroyed. So it's seriousness, formidable and sublime. Right? These are three very important factors of what your belief structure and is. So once again, if you're just going around trolling people and making jokes all day, there's nothing serious, formidable, or sublime about your work. But when people really attach that myth, that metaphysical, what he calls myth, to their politics, they open the door to a lot more action, a lot more passion within themselves for their cause, for their belief. Now you have people who are willing to go through hardships because they've attached this great metaphysical definition to that's so powerful. That's so powerful that the uber rational and logical intellectual would never be able to understand or comprehend. He looks at it as silly, and we feel sorry for those poor fools who are too smart for their own good, and they cover up their own inability to be a part of the collective and to overcome their cowardice, hiding it through their rational intellectualism. Those are not the doers of the world. The doers of the world are the people that attach myth and that use violence when necessary to promote the worldview, their worldview. And so it has been all throughout history. And so that's been our covering of Sorel's work, Reflections on Violence. I think we're living in an age where we're going to see his work become more pertinent to our age than it was in his. So very interesting times. Sorel's works are very interesting. There's a few books out there you can get on him. Reflections of Violence is, like I said, it's a very dated one, but it's a very good one. And he goes into detail about not only his theories on myth and violence and the impotence of the parliamentarian socialist, but everything from his thoughts on statism and how the guilds, work together and what is most formidable for socialism and the best direction forward. So definitely worth checking out.